I call the member for Macarthur.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise today to support the Classification, Publications, Films and Computer Games Amendment R18 Plus Computer Games Bill 2012. This bill introduces a R18 Plus classification into the Australian computer game classification categories. It also allows existing games to be submitted for reclassification once the R18 Plus classification is included. The current Australian classification regime under the Classification Act involves film, magazine and electronic game producers applying to the Classification Board for classification of their products. Applications must include supporting material that will assist the board in deciding the appropriate classification. For example, applicants seeking a classification for a computer game must include with their written application a copy of the game and a document outlining the details of the game, including description of the gameplay experience. Once the application and supporting material have been submitted to the board, the relevant entertainment media is then classified according to the principles and categories detailed in the 2005 National Classification Code and the guidelines for the classification of films and computer games. The 2005 Code sets out the classification tables for publications, films and computer games. Examining these tables reveals that computer games currently do not enjoy the capacity to be awarded an R18 Plus classification under Australia's entertainment media classification regime. Consequently, computer games that would otherwise fall in an R18 Plus classification currently face two prospects. Firstly, these games can be refused classification, in which case they cannot be sold, hired or exhibited, displayed or advertised in Australia. Alternatively, these games can be modified by the producer to comply with lower criteria of the MA15 Plus classification. These outcomes have significant implications for consumer choice in the computer games market and the ability to protect Australian children from unsuitable material in that market. Mr Deputy Speaker, it is universally recognised economic principle that consumer welfare is enhanced in a market if the consumers within that market have a large degree of choice between products. Indeed, such a principle is supported in Australia's classification regime, where a National Classification Code mandates that classification decisions are to give effect to the principle that adults should be able to read, hear and see what they want. Mr Deputy Speaker, the average age for a contemporary Australian computer gamer is 32, a person well into their adult years. In fact, 70% of computer game players in Australia are 18 years or older. This market characteristic has been recognised by computer game producers, who are now producing an increasing number of computer games for distribution in Australia that are more suitable to the maturity levels of adult game players. It is therefore curious that Australia remains the only developed nation that does not have an adult rating for computer games. Mr Deputy Speaker, computer game producers should not be denied the opportunity to develop games that appeal to the largest consumer group, nor should they be forced to modify their games so they comply with the more restrictive MA15 Plus classification if they wish to distribute their games to adults in the Australian market. This country has always encouraged, through appropriate and sensible supply-side regulation, the development of products by businesses that most effectively meet the demands of their market. The market for adult computer games should be no exception to this. On the demand side of the market, adult consumers should not have their choice in computer games restricted by a classification system that does not allow them to access games they would otherwise fall within an R18 Plus classification. This is much said in the National Classification Code guiding principle of adult freedom of choice. Mr Deputy Speaker, this bill will address these concerns by allowing those games the opportunity to be made available to Australia's adult game players under the R18 Plus classification. Additionally, the bill will allow games that have been refused classification previously to be resubmitted to the Classification Board for reclassification as R18+, so that they can be made available in Australia's computer game market. By improving consumer choice in this way, the bill will ensure the sustained growth of the Australian gaming industry, an industry that is forecast to grow at a rate of 10% per year. Madam Deputy Speaker, the second issue I'd like to raise about the absence of an R18 Plus classification for computer games in Australia is protecting Australia's children from unsuitable material. As I said earlier, games would otherwise be classified R18 Plus can be modified by their producers so they can meet the criteria within the MA15 Plus classification, therefore making them available to children. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is not a suitable outcome in our country's classification regime. This has been illustrated by a number of games which were initially deemed unsuitable for child gameplay and have been made available to Australian children through the retaining of an MA15+ classification. For example, the game Fallout 3 was initially refused classification by the Australian Classification Board for its realistic depictions of drug use. However, after some minor producer edits, Fallout 3 was able to be classified as an MA15+, despite the fact that the game is rated as only being suitable for those 18 years and older in Britain, New Zealand and Europe. The game Grand Theft Auto 4 provides a similar example, as it too, after some minor cosmetic edits, was able to be distributed to children under the MA15+ classification. Moreover, some games that are classified as being suitable for adults only in other countries are classified as MA15+ in Australia. The game House of the Dead Overkill is an example of this. It was classified MA15+ in Australia, despite the fact that it was classified as R18+ abroad. Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill will overcome this issue by introducing an R18+ classification for such games, thereby preventing their distribution to children. The bill will also allow games that are already in the Australian market to be submitted for reclassification by the Minister or a person who has been aggrieved by the prior classification decision. In this way, the regime will give effect to the National Classification Code guiding principle that minors should be protected from material likely to harm or disturb them. Madam Deputy Speaker, when it comes to entertainment and media, there's a need to ensure that everyone is protected from exposure to unsolicited material that they find offensive. In order for this to occur, people must be made aware of the content of such media before they experience. This is particularly the case for computer games, where consumers are not truly aware of the nature and content of the games before they begin playing them. Whilst not being able to totally inform the consumer of the content of the games, gameplay experience R18+ classification will go a long way in enabling consumers to perceive the nature of the gameplay experience and content when they are making their purchasing decisions. More importantly, the R18+ classification will allow parents to make informed decisions about the suitability of particular games for their children. Madam Deputy Speaker, the introduction of an R18+ classification for computer games in our classification regime is well supported. Indeed, when the issue of introducing such a classification was put to public consultation, 98% of those involved in that consultation supported introducing an R18+ classification for computer games. Further, Galaxy's research for National Telephone poll on the issue found that 80% of those people polled supported an R18+ classification. I know that people in my electorate, in Macarthur, also support the R18+ classification and want uniformity in classifications for films, television series and computer games. This will allow them to make an informed decision when purchasing computer games for both themselves and their children. And that is why I support this bill today, because it's good policy. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.